Hungarian civilians collapsed in tears when Americans saved their starving children from death. The children of Bábolna were dying, and the only people who could save them were the very men they'd been taught to fear. On a January morning, thick with fog and silence, American trucks rolled into the frozen Hungarian village, and mothers dropped to their knees in the snow, not out of fear, but because strangers were carrying bread, real bread, warm enough to steam in the cold, soft enough to break with shaking fingers. For weeks, the village had watched its youngest fade toward death, their cries dissolving into hoarse whispers. Now salvation had arrived in foreign uniforms, and the shock of it shattered something inside the mothers who had stopped hoping. Bábolna had become a graveyard wearing the shape of a town. The well had frozen solid 3 weeks earlier. Even its rope was trapped in a column of ice no one had the strength to break. Soviet tanks had crushed the October Revolution, grinding 11 days of hope back into dust. Windows hung open like wounded mouths. Doors sagged. Hunger ruled everything. Children chewed boiled leather. Old men gave up food so the young could survive another night, and every breath felt like a negotiation with death. One shallow inhale, then the terrifying question of whether the next would come. If stories like these matter to you, stay with me, because what those Americans found inside Bábolna was nothing like the world had told them to expect. In the cellar of a ruined schoolhouse, 10-year-old Esther Kovacs pressed her tiny hand to her father's chest, counting each breath as if she could buy him more time. Yosef had once been a teacher, gentle, soft-spoken, patient. Then the revolution came, and he became a freedom fighter. Now he was simply a dying man in a cold cellar, his infected leg poisoning him hour by hour. The smell of rot started 3 days ago. Esther knew what that meant. Everyone did. Her mother had disappeared during the Soviet reprisals, taken, fled, or buried. No one agreed on the truth, and Esther had stopped asking. In Bábolna, even truth had become a luxury, like food, like warmth, like hope. The villagers whispered about Americans approaching, but their voices carried more fear than comfort. State radio had warned them that Western aid was poison, that Americans photographed suffering for propaganda, that their food was a trap, that accepting help made you a traitor. Mothers told their children to hide if they ever saw foreign trucks. But that morning, as Esther leaned over her father counting breaths he could barely take, a low rumble swept across the plain. Not tanks, not Soviet engines, something else. She climbed the cellar steps and froze. Through the lifting mist, a column of trucks appeared, marked with white stars and red crosses, moving toward Bábolna with a purpose no one in the village could understand. And in that single moment, the entire village held its breath, wondering whether deliverance had come, or whether every fearful warning had finally come true. The news traveled through Bábolna the way sickness did, house to house, whispered through cracked doors, and passed between women hauling frozen water from the river. Americans were coming. Relief convoys had crossed into Hungary, some said through Austria, others claimed through Yugoslavia. The details shifted with each telling, but the core remained. Foreign trucks were moving toward the western villages, and Bábolna lay directly in their path. In the cramped kitchen of the old Nemeth farmhouse, a dozen villagers gathered around a single candle, their faces hollowed by shadow and hunger. They spoke in voices barely above breath, as if Soviet ears might be pressed against the frozen walls. "It's a trick," hissed Maria Farkas, clutching her infant daughter against her chest. The baby had stopped crying 2 days ago, too weak now to make sound. "The Americans want photographs. They'll capture our suffering on film and parade it across the world. Hungary's shame, broadcast for Western entertainment." "And the food?" asked old Tibor, the blacksmith whose forge had gone cold when the coal ran out. "You think they poison it?" "Why wouldn't they?" Maria shot back. "State radio warned us for years. The capitalists don't give anything for free. There's always a price, always a hook hidden inside the bread. Murmurs rippled through the room. Heads nodded. The propaganda had been thorough, planted deep over a decade of Soviet education. Western kindness was Western cunning. American smiles concealed American knives. To accept their help was to confess that socialism had failed, that Hungary could not feed its own children. The humiliation would be worse than the hunger. From the corner near the stove, where no fire burned, Father Bábolna cleared his throat. The old priest had survived the Nazis and the Soviets both, had watched his church converted to a grain warehouse and then burned during the uprising. He no longer wore his collar, but the village still looked to him when certainty crumbled. "I have lived long enough to know that starving men make poor philosophers," he said slowly, his voice like gravel scraping stone. "We can debate the Americans' motives until our children are too dead to benefit from our conclusions, or we can wait. Watch. See what they actually do before we decide what they actually want." Silence followed. The candle flickered. "And if it is poison?" Maria whispered. Father Bábolna met her eyes. In his gaze, Esther, watching from the doorway with her father's medicine wrapped in rags, saw something she had not expected: doubt. The old man who had counseled faith through every occupation, every betrayal, every loss, was no longer certain of anything. "Then we will have our answer," he said finally. "But if it is bread, real bread, and we refuse it while our children starve—" He trailed off, unable to complete the sentence. Outside, the wind carried the faint sound of engines growing closer. The village had perhaps hours to decide whether salvation or destruction was rolling toward them across the frozen plain. They came out of the morning mist like apparitions. 6 canvas-covered trucks rolling in a slow column down the frozen road that led into Bábolna. The engines growled low and steady, a sound so different from the sharp clatter of Soviet armor that the villagers did not immediately recognize it as machinery of war. Then the mist parted fully, and the markings became visible: white stars on olive drab, red crosses on white squares, and the strange bright stripes of the American flag rippling from radio antennas. No one moved. The village held its breath as the convoy ground to a halt in the square, brakes hissing, exhaust pluming white in the frozen air. Doors opened. Men climbed down, young men mostly, wearing thick coats and wool caps, their breath visible as they stamped their boots against the cold. They did not carry rifles at the ready. They carried clipboards and crates. From doorways and shattered windows, the people of Bábolna watched in silence. Mothers pulled children back from thresholds with sharp whispers. "Do not go near them. Do not take anything they offer. We do not know what they want." The propaganda echoed in every warning, every tight grip on a small shoulder. The Americans smiled and waved, seemingly unbothered by the reception. Perhaps they had seen this before in other villages. Perhaps they understood that trust was not something a truck could deliver. Esther watched from the cellar entrance of the schoolhouse, her father's coat wrapped around her shoulders. She counted the trucks, the men, the crates being unloaded onto the frozen square. Steam rose from somewhere, a field kitchen being assembled, pots already bubbling with something that smelled like meat and onions. Her stomach cramped so violently she nearly doubled over. When had she last smelled cooked meat? She could not remember. One of the Americans broke from the group. He was young, perhaps 23 or 24, with dark hair and a face that did not carry the hardness Esther had expected from Western soldiers. He moved slowly, deliberately, as if approaching a wounded animal. In his hands he held a tin cup, steam curling from its surface. He walked toward a cluster of children huddled near the old well, their mothers frozen in terror behind them. The young man knelt in the snow, bringing himself to their eye level, and held out the cup. The children stared. No one reached for it. Then he spoke. His accent was thick, the word clumsy on his tongue, clearly rehearsed 100 times on the journey here. but the meaning was unmistakable. Barat, friend. The word hung in the frozen air. One of the children, a boy of perhaps 6, his cheeks hollow and his eyes too large for his face, looked up at his mother. She stood paralyzed, caught between a decade of warnings and the simple truth of a warm cup offered by a kneeling stranger. The moment stretched. The village waited to see who would break first. The moment broke not with the boy by the well, but with Esther. She did not make a decision. Her body simply moved, driven by something deeper than thought, the memory of her father's shallow breathing, the smell of infection seeping through his bandages, the arithmetic of survival that told her he would not last another week without strength. She stepped out from the cellar entrance and walked across the square, her boots crunching on frozen snow, every eye in the village turning to follow her. The young American, the one who had spoken the word Barat, saw her coming. He rose slowly from his kneel, still holding the tin cup, and waited. He did not advance. He did not retreat. He simply stood there, letting her close the distance on her own terms. Esther stopped 2 feet away. Up close, she could see that his eyes were kind, crinkled at the corners as if he smiled often in another life. She could see the steam rising from the cup, smell the broth inside, beef and onion, and something savory that made her knees nearly buckle. Her hands trembled as she reached out, not for herself, but for the ghost of her father lying in the cellar below. The American placed the cup in her palms. The heat shocked her. She had forgotten what warmth felt like against skin, had lived so long in the kingdom of cold that the sensation almost registered as pain. She stood there, frozen, staring down at the brown liquid as if it might vanish. "Drink," the young man said softly, miming the motion with his hand. "For you." She raised the cup to her lips. The first sip burned her tongue, flooded her mouth with salt and fat and richness her body had forgotten existed. She swallowed, and the warmth spread down her throat into her hollow stomach like light entering a dark room. Her eyes blurred. She blinked, and the tears spilled over, cutting hot tracks down her wind-chapped cheeks. She had not cried when her mother vanished. She had not cried when her father's wound turned septic. She had locked it all away in a place where feeling could not reach her, because feeling was a luxury that got you killed. But the broth undid something inside her chest. The simple, impossible mercy of it, a stranger crossing half the world to kneel in the snow and offer soup to a child he had never met, cracked the wall she had built around herself. Esther sobbed. The sound tore out of her, raw and animal, and she could not stop it. The young American's composure broke too. He turned away quickly, pressing a gloved hand to his face, but not before she saw the wetness in his own eyes. Behind him, 2 other volunteers stood motionless, one with his jaw clenched tight, the other openly weeping without shame. In Bábolna, in that frozen square, enemies discovered they could not be enemies while watching a child cry over a cup of soup. 6,000 miles away, in offices smelling of coffee and cigarette smoke, the decision had been made with signatures and stamps. President Eisenhower had watched the newsreels from Hungary, the grainy footage of Soviet tanks rolling through Budapest, the bodies in the streets, the flood of refugees pouring across the Austrian border, and issued his orders. America would respond, not with soldiers, not with bombs, but with bread. The world was watching, and the Cold War would be fought one bowl of soup at a time. But policy was clean. Reality was not. The volunteers who crossed into Hungary had signed up for many reasons: adventure, idealism, escape from ordinary lives. What they found shattered every expectation. David Chen had imagined grateful crowds, heroic purpose, perhaps even a story to tell his grandchildren. Instead, he found villages where children no longer looked like children. Sunken eyes in oversized skulls, limbs thin as kindling, bellies swollen not from fullness, but from the body consuming itself. The first time he lifted a toddler and felt how light she was, like holding a paper lantern, he had to walk behind a truck and vomit into the snow. Yet the work continued. Logistics became its own form of love. Heating stations erected in town squares, medical triage tents where nurses sorted the dying from the salvable with terrible efficiency, calorie calculations scribbled on clipboards, how much food, distributed how quickly, to prevent refeeding syndrome from killing those they had come to save. The mathematics of mercy allowed no sentiment. Every crate counted. Every hour mattered. At night, the volunteers wrote letters home they would never send, unable to explain what they had witnessed, unable to forget the weight of a child who weighed almost nothing at all. Sarah Mitchell found Josef Kovacs on the second day, when Esther finally led her down the cellar stairs. The smell hit first, the sweet rot of infection that Sarah had learned to recognize in field hospitals across 2 continents. She knelt beside the makeshift bed of old coats and straw, pulling back the filthy bandage on Josef's leg with gloved hands. The wound beneath was angry red, streaked with the dark tributaries of blood poisoning climbing toward his groin. Another week, perhaps less, and the infection would reach his heart. Josef's eyes fluttered open. He saw the American uniform and flinched, trying to pull away, but his body had no strength left for resistance. Words tumbled from his cracked lips. Hungarian, incomprehensible to Sarah, but the tone needed no translation. Fear, refusal, the stubborn pride of a man who had fought for his country and could not bear to be saved by strangers. Esther crouched between them, her small face taut with desperation. She spoke to her father in rapid Hungarian, her voice breaking, her hands gripping his arm. Sarah did not understand the words, but she understood the argument. "Please, let her help. I cannot lose you too." The fight drained out of Josef. He closed his eyes and turned his head away. Not consent, but surrender. Sarah worked quickly. She cleaned the wound, cutting away dead tissue with steady hands, while Esther held a lantern close. Then she prepared the injection. Penicillin, the small glass vial worth more than gold in this frozen wasteland. The needle slid into Josef's arm. The medicine entered his blood, and then there was nothing to do but wait. Esther sat beside her father through the night, her hand pressed to his chest, counting heartbeats, terrified to hope and unable to stop. The storm came without warning on the third night, howling down from the Carpathians like a living thing with teeth. Within an hour, the village disappeared beneath a wall of white. Snow piled against doors, buried the trucks to their axles, and turned the square into a featureless plain where a man could lose his way between 2 buildings and freeze to death in the crossing. There was no question of the Americans leaving now. The convoy was trapped, and so the 2 peoples who had been taught to fear each other found themselves sharing the same fires, the same shelters, the same desperate fight against the cold. Boundaries dissolved in the darkness. Hungarian mothers who had warned their children against foreign poison now huddled beside American volunteers, bodies pressed together for warmth. Old Tibor the blacksmith worked shoulder to shoulder with a sergeant from Ohio, feeding scrap wood into a barrel fire that kept the medical tent from freezing. Father Bela led prayers in Hungarian, while a young volunteer from Chicago bowed his head beside him, not understanding the words but recognizing the need. In the cellar, Josef's fever spiked. Esther felt the change before she saw it, the sudden furnace heat of her father's skin, the violent tremors that shook his entire body. His breathing turned ragged, shallow, wrong. She called out for Sarah, her voice swallowed by the howling wind above, and when the medic finally descended the stairs with her lantern, Esther saw the fear she felt reflected in the American woman's eyes. "His body is fighting," Sarah said, already preparing another injection. "The infection is breaking, but the fever—" She did not finish. Esther understood. Her father was balanced on the edge of a knife. The next hours would decide everything. "What do I do?" Esther whispered. Sarah met her gaze. "You let me work. You trust me. and you stay with him. It was the hardest thing Esther had ever done, harder than hunger, harder than cold, harder than watching her mother disappear into the night. She released her grip on control, stepped back from her father's side, and placed his life entirely in the hands of a stranger from a country she had been taught to hate. The storm raged, Sarah worked, and Esther prayed to a God she was no longer certain existed, bargaining with the darkness for one more dawn. Morning came slowly, the light filtering through the snow-crusted windows like a whispered apology. The storm had exhausted itself sometime before dawn, leaving behind a silence so complete that Esther could hear her own heartbeat in the stillness. She had not slept. She had sat beside her father through the endless night, watching Sarah change compresses, administer injections, check his pulse with fingers that never trembled, even when her eyes betrayed exhaustion. Sometime after midnight, the shaking had stopped. Sometime after that, Yosef's breathing had steadied into something that sounded less like struggle and more like rest. Now, in the pale grey light, Esther saw her father's eyes flutter open. He looked at her, truly looked, not the glassy half-seeing of fever, but the clear gaze she remembered from before the revolution, before the wound, before everything fell apart. His cracked lips moved, and though no sound emerged, she read the shape of her name. Papa. The word broke from her chest like something caged too long. She pressed her forehead to his hand and wept, not the desperate tears of the square, but something softer, something that felt like release. Sarah sat slumped against the cellar wall, her medical bag open beside her, her eyes closed in the first sleep she had taken in 30 hours. Esther looked at this stranger who had fought through the night for a man she did not know, in a country that was not her own, and felt something shift permanently in her understanding of the world. Above them, the village was emerging from the snowdrifts. Esther climbed the stairs and stepped into a scene that stopped her breath. Children were laughing. The sound was so foreign, so impossible, that she did not recognize it at first. But there they were, Hungarian children and American volunteers building crude figures in the snow, throwing clumsy snowballs, their breath pluming in the cold air as giggles echoed off the ruined buildings. A sergeant was teaching a group of boys a clapping game. A young volunteer was carrying a toddler on his shoulders, making hoarse sounds while she shrieked with delight. Language had not disappeared, but somewhere in the night it had stopped mattering. Father Bábolna stood in the square, watching. When he saw Esther, he smiled. A real smile, the first she had seen on his face since October. "Your father?" he asked. "Alive?" she whispered. "He's alive." The old priest closed his eyes and crossed himself. Around them, the village of Bábolna was learning to breathe again. The convoys departed on a morning that tasted almost like spring. Snow still blanketed the fields, but the air had softened, carrying the faint promise of thaw. The trucks were loaded now with empty crates rather than full ones, their cargo distributed across a dozen villages that had been pulled back from the edge of oblivion. Engines rumbled to life in the square where, just weeks ago, Esther had taken her first cup of broth from a stranger's hands. Josef Kovac stood in the doorway of the schoolhouse, leaning on a crutch the Americans had fashioned from scrap lumber and canvas straps. His leg would never be the same. Sarah had told them plainly that he would walk with a limp for the rest of his life. But he would walk. He would live. In a winter that had taken so many, this was nothing short of resurrection. Esther stood beside him, watching the volunteers make their final rounds. David Chen moved through the crowd, shaking hands, embracing children who clung to his legs, pressing small gifts into the palms of mothers who had once warned their families to hide from him. His eyes were red. He was not the only one. Sarah approached last. She carried her medical bag over one shoulder, her face drawn with fatigue, but her posture straight. She stopped before Josef and Esther, seeming to search for words that did not require translation. Josef spoke first. His English was broken, rehearsed in whispers over the past 3 days, but unmistakable. "Thank you, for my life, for my daughter." Sarah's composure cracked. She pressed her lips together, nodded once, and pulled Esther into an embrace so fierce the girl felt the air leave her lungs. No words passed between them. None were needed. Then the Americans climbed into their trucks, the engines growled, and the convoy rolled out of Bábolna the same way it had arrived, slowly, steadily, without fanfare. Villagers lined the road, waving, weeping, holding up children to see. The trucks disappeared into the mist, and the sound of engines faded until only silence remained. But it was a different silence now. Not the silence of death, the silence of beginning. Esther reached into her coat pocket and felt the crinkle of paper against her fingertips. She pulled it out. A chocolate wrapper, American letters printed in bright red and silver, saved from the single square David had given her on the second day. She had not eaten the chocolate herself. She had melted it slowly on her father's tongue when he was too weak to chew, letting the sweetness remind him that there were reasons to keep breathing. Now she smoothed the wrapper flat and folded it carefully, a talisman she would carry for the rest of her life. Decades later, when journalists asked elderly Hungarians what they remembered most about the winter of 1957, the answers rarely mentioned politics or Cold War strategy. They spoke of small things: a cup of warm broth, a word spoken in broken Hungarian, the sound of children laughing after months of silence. They spoke of strangers who crossed an iron curtain carrying not weapons but bread, and in doing so proved that mercy needed no translation. Esther Kovacs would tell her grandchildren the story every winter, pulling the faded wrapper from a small wooden box and letting them hold it in their hands. "This is what saved us," she would say. "Not the food, not the medicine. The fact that someone came. The fact that someone cared enough to cross the whole world and kneel in the snow for a child they had never met." She would pause then, her eyes distant, seeing not the comfortable room around her, but a frozen village square, and a young man holding out a cup of soup. "That is how you defeat hatred," she would finish, "not with armies, with bread, with presents, with the stubborn, foolish, holy act of feeding your enemy's children." The wrapper stayed in the family for generations, a scrap of paper that outlasted empires, proof that once, in the coldest winter of a broken century, humanity had chosen mercy over vengeance. And that choice had made all the difference. If this story moved you, like and subscribe to Join Us as we uncover more forgotten moments when ordinary people chose compassion over hatred. Share this with someone who needs to be reminded that kindness can cross any border, and leave a comment below. What small act of mercy changed your life?